The first image that still grips me isn't from Denver or from any place I knew back then. It's a doorway in the woods framed by boards that don't quite meet edges, splintered and soft from years of wet snow and thin mountain sun. Smoke is drifting out from somewhere behind it, thin and gray, the way paper smolders when it doesn't quite catch. The air around that doorway looks colder than it should, even in the footage, like the light itself is holding its breath. A woman stands there barefoot on rough dirt skin stretched tight over her cheekbones, lips pulled into a smile that never reaches her eyes. The wind is pushing her hair across her face, but she doesn't brush it away. She just stares past the people in front of her as if she's watching something none of us can see. Someone says her name, a name she doesn't seem to recognize, and the only sound she makes is a low, repeated murmur, words slipping out of her mouth like they've been carved there. Every time I see that frame, the doorway, the smoke, that fixed, aching smile, I feel the air in my own kitchen go still, as if the mountains are pressing their weight through the glass. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from, and follow if you believe some names should never fade. Back in June of 2018, before that doorway and that smoke, my life felt small and ordinary in the way you only appreciate after it's been shattered. I spent my days moving quietly through long fluorescent-lit corridors at the hospice, the soft beep of monitors and the rhythmic hiss of oxygen machines filling the background while I checked charts and adjusted blankets. Denver in early summer has a particular feel to it. The air warm, but still thin sunlight bouncing hard off glass high-rises in the afternoon, then softening into gold as it slid down toward the foothills. On my days off, I'd open the windows in my two-bedroom apartment, let in the smell of hot asphalt and distant cut grass, and call my younger sister while I folded laundry or stirred a pot on the stove. You could always tell where she was by the sound behind her office chatter and printers when she was at work traffic and music when she was driving that low, hollow hum of wind when she was already thinking about the mountains. Megan's world was louder and sharper than mine. She worked long hours at an architecture firm downtown, sketching sleek office buildings and townhomes for people who would never know her name. When she talked about it, I could hear the rustle of tracing paper and the clack of her mechanical pencil as she moved around her desk. She liked the work well enough, but she loved the moments when she could step away from it, when she could point her car toward the west and watch the city peel away in the rear view. "The mountains make sense," she told me once over the phone while I rinsed coffee grounds from a filter at my kitchen sink. "They don't care what you look like or how many emails you've answered. You just put one foot in front of the other and they tell you if you're strong enough." We grew up in a small town in Kansas where the horizon was flat and the wind never stopped. I think that's why the Colorado high country grabbed her so hard when she first saw it in college. Those jagged ridges against the sky must have felt like a land from another planet. She was in her early 20s then. By the time she was 35, she had a shelf in her apartment lined with guidebooks, folded topo maps, and dog-eared trail descriptions. When I visited her, there was always a faint smell of pine resin in her place from the branches and cones she brought back and left on the windowsill. Her boots stayed by the door, dusted with red and gray dirt that never quite came off, no matter how often she knocked them together. Silverton was a name I heard long before I ever saw the town. To Megan, it was almost mythic, a little former mining town tucked into the San Juan Mountains between steep walls of rock and snow that lingered in the shadows long after it melted elsewhere. She described it to me like she was describing a movie set. Old brick buildings, wooden storefronts, narrow streets that turned into dirt sooner than you expected. She loved that once the ski season ended, the place quieted down to the sound of trucks on gravel, a dog barking somewhere down a side street, and the occasional train whistle echoing off the slopes. "The sky feels closer there," she said one night, her voice soft in my ear while I lay on my couch with the lights off. "Like if you stand still long enough, the clouds will just brush your shoulders." That spring 2018, she started talking about the Colorado Trail again. Not the whole thing, she didn't have that kind of time, but a rugged section near Silverton, near one of the high passes where the trail cut across scree and alpine meadows and old mining roads. She'd wanted to hike that stretch since college, she said. Back then, she didn't have the money for good gear or the confidence to go alone. Now she had both, or at least thought she did. I remember one Sunday afternoon in May, the smell of onions and garlic in my kitchen as I cooked the ceiling fan ticking softly overhead while she rattled off elevation numbers and trail miles like she was reading from a recipe she'd already memorized. "I'll keep it simple," she told me. 5 days, in and out. I'll stay in Silverton the night before, start early, and be back in Denver by the end of the week. I could hear pages sliding as she turned her guidebook. There was a little hitch in her voice when she said, "I need to get out of my head, Lore. I'm starting to dream in blueprints." I laughed, but there was a tired edge to it. We both knew that between my work with the dying and her work with deadlines, we weren't exactly living the slow, easy lives we'd once imagined. The days leading up to her trip were full of small, ordinary details that only feel important in hindsight. On my way home from a late shift, I'd pass the big outdoor store off the highway, its fake rock facade lit up in harsh white, and think of her inside comparing stove fuel and freeze-dried meals. She texted me a picture of a new backpack spread open on her floor, the fabric a deep forest green straps tangled like a sleeping animal. There was another photo of a handheld GPS unit glowing faintly in the dark, and one of a paper map laid flat on her dining table, its folds smoothed out bright contour lines looping like fingerprints. I even got one of those satellite messengers she told me over the phone, the faint buzz of traffic coming through in the background. "No excuses. I'll check in every night. You can nag me from the couch." We met in person 2 nights before she left. She drove over to my place after work, her car tires crunching over the gravel in the parking lot, the engine ticking as it cooled in the warm evening air. I opened the door and the smell of dust and sun-baked upholstery came in with her, along with that particular dry scent of pine from the air freshener she kept hanging from the rearview mirror. She dropped her pack on my living room rug and it hit the floor with a solid weight, all buckles and straps and coiled rope. We ate takeout at my small wooden table, stir-fry for me, salad, and bread for her, while the ceiling fan pushed around the heat and the radio murmured low in the other room. Megan looked tired, but the kind of tired that comes from planning something you really want. Her hair was pulled back with a bandana, cheeks still faintly flushed from a long day at the office. She talked about contour intervals and water sources between bites, then drifted into stories about clients and difficult contractors, her hands moving in small, precise gestures like she was still explaining a design to someone. Every now and then she'd fall quiet and listen to the sound of a motorcycle passing on the street outside, or the hum of my refrigerator kicking on. "That's what I like about the back country," she said, finally leaning back in her chair, fingers wrapped around a sweating glass of iced tea. The noise turned simple. Wind water, your own breathing. You don't have to sort any of it. I remember looking at her then and thinking she looked older than 35, but in a way that suited her. There was a steadiness in her, something settled from all the years of learning how to move through difficult spaces, construction sites, meetings, city streets. At the same time, there was a restlessness I didn't quite know what to do with, like she was already half turned toward the mountains, even though we were sitting at my kitchen table. I reached over and squeezed her wrist, feeling the faint tackiness of sunscreen still on her skin. "Text me when you get to town," I said. "Send me a picture of whatever you eat. I want to live vicariously through your vacation." The next evening after my shift, I came home to a voicemail from her. The house smelled like coffee and lemon cleaner. I'd left a half-finished mug on the counter that morning, and it had gone cold and bitter. Her voice on the machine was brisk and bright. She was finishing up work, she said, and would leave before dawn to beat the traffic. There was the faint rustle of paper in the background, and the distant rumble of a bus passing under her apartment window. "Don't worry," she added. "I've got this." I didn't sleep very well that night. Not because I was afraid for her, at least that's what I told myself, but because my body had gotten used to the odd broken rhythm of night shifts and on-call hours. The city outside my window was quieter than usual. Even the usual late sirens seemed to keep their distance. I lay there on top of the covers watching the faint glow from the street lamp creep along the ceiling, listening to the hum of the air conditioner and the occasional car sighing past on the wet pavement. Somewhere around 2 a.m, my phone buzzed on the nightstand, a brief vibration that made the wood rattle softly. It was just a weather alert, a notice about heat and clear skies for the coming week, the kind of thing you swipe away without thinking. Early the next morning, while the air was still cool and the light coming in my kitchen window was that soft, colorless gray it has before sunrise, I got a text from her. A picture came first. The dashboard of her car, fuel gauge, full coffee in the cup holder, a strip of highway stretching ahead already bright under a pale sky. There was a faint reflection of her fingers on the steering wheel and the glass nails, short and clean, one knuckle smudged with ink. Below the photo were a few words, something about the mountains looking clear, her plan to reach Silverton before lunch, a promise to check in once she'd settled. I could almost hear the hum of her tires on the asphalt as I stood barefoot on the cool tile, the smell of my own coffee drifting up in small, comforting waves. I tapped out a reply with one hand while the kettle hissed behind me, told her to be careful, added a little mountain emoji she'd sent me 100 times. The day moved on the way days do when you have no idea they're important. I showered, dressed, drove to work with the radio, low the sky already turning bright and hard blue over the city. At the hospice, the air smelled like disinfectant and hand soap. I checked medications, held a woman's hand while she drifted off to sleep, signed off on a chart with my usual looping signature. Somewhere around mid-morning during a lull at the nurse's station, I glanced at my phone and saw another text had come in earlier, a simple line about having made it to town, a photo of a narrow street with old buildings and mountains rising behind them like a backdrop. I studied the picture for a moment, the sun sharp on the brick, the shadows cool and deep in the alleys, and felt a brief, soft tug of wanting to be there instead of where I was. Then a call light went on down the hall, and I set the phone face down on the counter and went back to work. That evening, after a long, slow shift, I drove home with the windows cracked, the warm air smelling faintly of exhaust and cut grass from someone's lawn. The sky over Denver was streaked with pink and orange, the kind of sunset that makes the mountains look like a dark, solid wall on the horizon. When I stepped into my apartment, the air inside felt cooler, a little stale, the way it does after a day with everything shut. I kicked off my shoes, set my keys in the bowl by the door, and let the quiet settle around me. Refrigerator buzzing, pipes ticking in the walls, the soft whir of the ceiling fan above the living room. My phone was on the counter where I'd left it that morning, screen dark. I remember thinking it was strange I hadn't heard a new message yet, but I told myself she was probably having dinner or walking around town or already in bed with earplugs in, saving her energy for the trail. I turned on the small lamp over the sink, its yellow shade casting a warm circle of light onto the counter, and started rinsing dishes. Outside, somewhere down the block, a dog barked once and fell silent, and a car door closed with a hollow thud. I kept glancing at the phone out of the corner of my eye, waiting for it to buzz, to light up, to do something. It stayed still, the black glass reflecting the little lamp, and a slice of my own face blurred by the curve. After a while, I wiped my hands on a dish towel, walked over and checked it anyway. No new texts, no missed calls, just the same lock screen and the same quiet. I set it back down, screen facing up this time, and told myself not to be ridiculous. The lamp over the sink burned on as the sky outside went from blue to deep indigo, and when I finally went to bed, I left it lit, thinking I'd get up in a few minutes to turn it off. By the time morning came, that little circle of yellow light was still shining on an empty counter and a silent phone. The morning after that little lamp burned all night, I woke with a tight feeling in my chest that I tried to dismiss as the leftovers of restless sleep. The air in my apartment was cool and still carrying that faint metallic smell that comes after running the AC for too many hours. I padded into the kitchen barefoot, the tile cold under my toes, and picked up my phone expecting assuming there'd be a message waiting. Nothing. Just the same dark screen, not even a stray notification blinking in the corner. I told myself she was already on the trail, already moving through thin mountain air where signals vanished. She'd warned me that would happen. But as I poured my coffee, the silence in the room felt different. Heavier somehow, like the air wasn't moving right. Around mid-morning, during a break at work, I stepped outside the hospice onto the shaded side of the small concrete patio. The sun was high, the sky washed clean of clouds, and the faint smell of cut grass drifted from somewhere down the street. I tried calling her then. The ring went on longer than normal before dropping to voicemail, her recorded voice sounding too bright, too rehearsed. I stood there with the phone pressed to my ear, listening to that canned cheerfulness fade into a soft click. I told myself she was already past the first ridge, maybe tucked into a switchback where the walls of rock swallowed signals whole. Still, I sent a text, just a simple, "How's the morning looking?" and slid the phone into my scrubs pocket. I tried to let it go. Hours passed in that drifting way they do in medical work. Med checks, quiet conversations, machines humming under steady fluorescent light. Every time I stepped into the hallway, I felt the weight of my phone in my pocket like a small stone. During lunch, I checked again. Nothing. Not even the little delivered tag under my messages. The cafeteria smelled like tomato soup and reheated bread, and I sat at a corner table picking at a salad I didn't want telling myself she'd probably turned the device off to save battery. That she was fine. That I was being ridiculous. By the time my shift ended and I stepped out into the early evening heat, the sky had softened into that peach-colored glow that comes before dusk. I rolled down the car windows, letting the warm air blow in as I drove home. The smell of exhaust and sun-baked asphalt followed me all the way to my parking lot. Once inside my apartment, I realized I'd been holding my breath without meaning to. I set my bag down, flicked on the living room lamp, and tried calling again. Straight to voicemail. I called a second time, thinking maybe I'd misdialed, maybe my thumb had slipped. Same thing. That bright, cheerful voice. That soft, final click. For the first time, something cold moved along my spine. I knew she'd rented a room in Silverton for the night before she set out. So I tried the lodge. The line rang a long time before a man answered, his voice warm and edged with fatigue. The background sounded quiet. No chatter, no clinking dishes, just the soft hum of a desk fan. When I asked if she'd checked out that morning, he confirmed it without hesitation. Left early, he said. Looked excited. Headed for the pass. He didn't sound worried. Not in the slightest. That helped, but only for a moment. After we hung up, I stood in the center of my living room, the carpet soft under my bare feet, listening to the ceiling fan turn above me. The place felt too quiet, as if the entire apartment had turned inward. I pressed my palms against my thighs to keep them from shaking. I tried another text, then another. I kept telling myself the same story: mountains block signals, she'll check in, I'm overreacting. But by the time the sun dipped behind the buildings outside my window, washing my living room in muted purple light, the silence felt more like a warning than an inconvenience. I called her again around 9. The phone didn't even try to ring. It went straight to voicemail. That was when something inside me shifted. I walked out onto my balcony, hoping the cool night air would settle me. Instead, the sound of distant traffic felt sharper than usual, and the glow of streetlights along the block seemed too bright. In the dark, I played back her last message from the previous morning. I listened to her talk about the drive, about the light on the mountains, about being excited to finally get moving. But what caught me was the faint tremble in her breath between sentences. I hadn't heard it before. I don't know if it was real or if my memory reshaped it later, but it pressed on me then, like a small hand. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept my phone next to me, the charger plugged in screen facing up. Every time I dozed, I woke with a start, reaching for the device, expecting it to buzz at any moment. The sky outside the windows stayed dark, the faint glow of distant city lights barely touching the edges of the blinds. Around 3 a.m, the refrigerator kicked on abruptly, its rumble slicing through the silence and making my heart jump. For a moment, I wished I could hear her laugh at me for being so jumpy. By dawn, with the bedroom filling slowly with a dim gray light, I had made up my mind. I called the county sheriff's office in Silverton. The dispatcher picked up with a calm, practiced voice. When I explained the situation where she was hiking when she should have checked in, there was a pause on the line long enough for me to notice the faint whir of static behind her. Then she said she'd notify someone to look into it and asked for my number in case they needed more information. She didn't sound alarmed, but she didn't dismiss me either. I sat at the edge of my bed after the call, fingers curled around the phone, feeling the slight tackiness of the silicone case under my palms. The air smelled faintly of last night's coffee grounds. The city outside was waking up cars, starting a dog barking somewhere below, but none of it seemed connected to me. I dialed the lodge again around 8, hoping they might have heard from her. The same man answered. He remembered her clearly, he said. He'd talked to her about the trail about the weather. She had looked confident, steady. He sounded almost puzzled when I told him she hadn't checked in. Around mid-morning, the sheriff's department called back. A deputy voice, steady and warm, told me they'd send someone to the trailhead to take a look. Probably nothing, he said. Signals are spotty up there. The way he said it eased something in me, even though the tightness never fully let go. I thanked him, hung up, and paced the length of my apartment, the carpet muffling my steps. I kept looking at the clock, at my phone, at the slant of sunlight creeping across the wall, as if any of those things held answers. It was early afternoon when they called again. This time, the deputy cleared his throat before speaking. He said they'd found her SUV parked at the trailhead exactly where hikers usually left their cars. The windows were clean, the paint sun-warmed, the tires dusted with pale grit. Inside, they saw her wallet, her identification, her phone, all tucked neatly where she'd left them. Nothing out of the ordinary, he said. Just hasn't been moved. Something in me went hollow then. I thanked him again, though I barely remember the words coming out of my mouth. After we hung up, I stood at the kitchen counter, hands pressed flat to the cool laminate, listening to the quiet hum of the air vent. A parked car was ordinary. A quiet phone could be ordinary too. But those pieces together, her belongings untouched, her voice, absent, felt like a door closing somewhere I couldn't reach. A little before 4, the sun shifted through my front windows, turning the apartment gold for a moment before settling into late afternoon shadows. That light always feels warm normally, but that day it looked wrong, almost too soft against the stillness of my living room. I tried calling her again, hoping against hope she'd pick up and laugh at my panic. Voicemail. That same cheerful greeting. That same soft click. When the knock finally came at my door, it was light, 2 taps, then quiet. I walked over slowly, each step sounding too loud in the apartment. Through the peephole, I saw a sheriff's deputy standing in the hallway, hat pulled off, held respectfully against his chest. The hallway light behind him flickered once and steadied. I opened the door and he gave me a small, patient nod. His voice was gentle when he asked if he could come in for a moment. And right then, with the sun low in the sky and the hum of my refrigerator filling the silence between us, I knew the calm world I'd been holding on to had already slipped away. By the time the deputy stepped into my apartment that morning, the sun had risen far enough to throw a pale rectangle of light across my living room floor. He stood just inside the doorway, hat in his hands, boots leaving faint dust on the entry mat. The smell of the hallway, a mix of old carpet and cleaning solution, followed him in. His voice was steady as he explained they'd found Megan's SUV untouched and her things inside just as she'd packed them. He said they were starting a formal look, the kind of phrase meant to keep someone calm. But the tone underneath it told me the worry was no longer just mine. They asked me to ride down to Silverton to talk in person and go over what they knew. The drive south felt longer than it was. The farther we got from Denver, the more the air changed cooler, drier, carrying the scent of dust and pine sap. By the time the road began to weave through the foothills, we were passing trucks loaded with kayaks and campers headed for the slopes weekend travelers who had no idea my entire world was tightening into a single point. The deputy, a quiet man named Lewis, didn't talk much. His radio crackled sporadically, voices fading in and out like ghosts passing overhead. When we reached Silverton, the town looked exactly the way Megan had described it. Small buildings with peeling paint, flower pots on wooden porches, mountains rising like dark walls on every side. But the normal charm of it all felt muted, as if the place itself knew something was wrong. Sheriff's vehicles were pulled into angled spaces near the trail office, their light bars catching the afternoon sun. I kept catching the faint smell of gasoline and cold metal as deputies moved between their cars and the small building where they planned the search. Inside, a ranger unfolded a large topographical map across a table scarred with knife marks and coffee rings. The paper crackled under his palms. A few deputies leaned in, arms crossed, radios clipped to their belts. They traced ridge lines with thick fingers, discussing which areas were safe to cover and which were too steep for volunteers. Someone mentioned bringing in dogs. Someone else talked about calling a helicopter crew stationed farther west. Their voices were low but purposeful, the sound of people who've done this before and know how quickly daylight slips away in the mountains. They asked me to walk them through Megan's plans, what trailhead she'd planned to use, how many days she expected to be gone, what gear she carried. I told them everything I knew, my voice catching only once when I mentioned the picture she'd texted me from the road. A deputy jotted notes on a small pad, the scratch of his pen oddly loud in the cramped room. Every time the door opened and a burst of mountain air swept in, the map fluttered, and I felt my stomach tighten again. I stayed at the station while they sent the first team out. The door shut behind them, boots thumping down the front steps, radios clicking on. I watched from the window as they moved toward the trucks, some adjusting their packs, others tightening straps on their vests. A search dog, an older shepherd with gray around the muzzle, jumped out of the back seat of one SUV, shook off the stiffness from the ride, and immediately lowered his nose to the gravel. His handler patted his flank, murmuring something I couldn't hear. The rest of that afternoon felt suspended. The light outside shifted along the walls, bright at first, then pale and thin as clouds rolled in over the ridge. Deputies came in and out, tracking mud across the wooden floor, their cheeks flushed with cold and exertion. Each time one returned, my heart clenched, and each time they told me the same thing, nothing yet. They said it carefully, gently, but the word yet kept ringing in my ears like a small bell. Near sunset, a helicopter arrived. I heard it before I saw it, a distant thump, thump, thump echoing through the valley, rattling the windows. The blades sent dust swirling up from the landing area, turning the air yellow and gritty. The machine looked almost too large for that little town, its shadows sweeping across rooftops and the old wooden storefronts. As it lifted off again to scan the slopes near the pass, I felt a strange tightening in my chest. Watching that aircraft hover over the mountains made everything feel both more hopeful and more terrifying. Hopeful that they might see something from the air, terrifying that they needed such a machine at all. I didn't sleep that night. They set me up in a spare room behind the station, a space usually used for equipment overflow. The cot was thin and the faint smell of oil clung to the blankets. I lay there listening to the wind moan against the eaves and the occasional murmur of deputies talking in the hall. Every time a radio chirped, I sat upright, pulse quickening, waiting for someone to knock and tell me news. But no knock came. The mountains outside stayed dark and quiet, as if holding their secrets tight. Early the next morning, teams gathered again. The sun rose slowly over the peaks, casting long blue shadows across the ground. The air was crisp enough to sting my nose. Steam curled from the coffee cups clutched in cold hands. A ranger named Holt spread the map again on the hood of a truck, its paint still cold from the night air. He marked new sections with a bright orange pen areas they hadn't reached yet. Volunteers from town began to arrive, locals in worn boots and faded jackets, some carrying trekking poles, others with day packs slung over one shoulder. Their faces showed a mixture of determination and quiet sadness. These mountains had claimed people before. Everyone knew it. When the teams moved out, I followed as far as they would allow. The gravel crackled under my shoes, and the smell of damp earth filled the air as we neared the trailhead. Megan's SUV still sat there, a thin layer of dust beginning to settle on its blue surface. Seeing it again exactly as she left it sent a wave of dizziness through me. I gripped the strap of my bag to steady myself. One of the deputies noticed and stepped closer, offering a soft word, a steadying hand. I nodded, trying to breathe through the tightness in my chest. The dogs picked up her scent quickly at first, tails wagging, noses pressed to the ground. Their handlers moved with practiced steps, letting the animals lead them up the trail. I followed at a distance with one deputy, the morning air cool against my cheeks. The trail was narrow dirt, packed hard from years of hikers, bordered by tufts of grass and scattered stones. For a while, the dog seemed confident, pulling slightly on the leash, weaving through patches of sunlight that slipped between tall pines. I watched the back of the handler's jacket rise and fall with each breath. Then abruptly, the dog stopped. Head up, body still. The handler knelt, spoke softly, encouraged him to continue. The dog circled once, nose sweeping the ground, then looked back toward the parking area. The handler tried again, offering him a scent article they carried in a sealed bag. Same result. It was as if the trail simply dissolved on that rocky patch. The handler's expression tightened in a way that made my stomach drop. He didn't say anything in front of me, but his eyes told enough. They tried widening the search area from that point, fanning out along the slope. Every footstep sent small stones clicking down the hillside. Boots scuffed against loose grit. Radios buzzed with short updates, the voices distant and muffled by static. Someone called in to say they found an old piece of metal rust curling its edges, but it wasn't recent. Another volunteer spotted a scrap of fabric snagged on a branch, but it turned out to be part of an old tent someone had abandoned years before. Each time something promising appeared, it dissolved as quickly as it came. By midday, clouds had started to gather over the peaks, heavy and gray, drifting in with a cold breeze. The light dimmed, washing the forest in a muted, bluish glow. Every sound seemed sharper in that stillness. The rustle of branches overhead, the soft clack of carabiners on someone's pack, the distant cry of a bird circling high above. I felt the chill seep through my jacket as we continued searching, each step growing heavier. People started whispering theories. Some tried to keep them quiet around me, but sound carries in the mountains. A few locals spoke about hikers who'd wandered off trail and gotten caught in sudden drops. Others mentioned old mining shafts hidden beneath brush, their entrances unstable and dangerous. One deputy murmured to another that someone had reported an unfamiliar truck parked on a nearby service road the day after Megan set out, though nobody had gotten the plate. Someone else wondered if she'd doubled back the first night and taken an unmarked spur trail. Theories kept stacking in the air like smoke, never solid, always shifting. Those whispers weren't unkind. They were the only way people knew how to fill the silence. But each one settled on me like a small weight. I found myself studying every tree trunk, every rock, as if she might step out from behind one at any moment. The longer we searched with nothing to show for it, the more the mountain began to feel like a vast, indifferent maze. By late afternoon, the temperature had dropped. A low rumble rolled across the valley, thunder still miles away but approaching. The deputies decided to wrap up for the day before the storm reached us. As we made our way back down, the wind picked up, carrying the smell of rain and the electric tang that precedes a storm. The trail, once so clear under morning light, now looked darker, more uncertain. Every footstep seemed to echo in the narrowing space between us and the parking lot. Back at the trailhead, the first drops began to fall, tapping lightly on the roof of a patrol car. The searchers gathered in small groups near the vehicles, some rubbing their hands together for warmth, others staring off toward the ridge with tired eyes. Radios crackled with updates about tomorrow's plan, more grid searches, additional teams arriving, a broader sweep of the surrounding slopes. I stood next to Megan's SUV, running my fingertips along the cool metal of the driver's door. The window reflected only my own tired face, gray-blue sky behind me. The air smelled like wet earth now, and the wind tugged at the hem of my jacket. For a moment, everything felt suspended again, the storm, the search, the unanswered questions. Then Deputy Lewis stepped out of one of the trucks holding a small object wrapped in a clear evidence bag. He glanced at another officer before walking toward the sheriff. The rain began to fall harder, a steady patter on the gravel. I watched from a few steps away as the sheriff studied the item, his brow tightening, his fingers tapping the plastic once. He murmured something low to Lewis, then looked up toward the ridge, his expression shifting in a way I couldn't read. The storm darkened the sky a shade deeper, and in that quiet moment, before anyone spoke to me, before I knew what they'd found or where the next day would lead, I felt the first real tremor of something deeper, something waiting just beyond the trees, patient and cold as stone. The shift came on the third morning just after sunrise, when the cold air still carried the scent of wet stone from the night before. I was standing near the row of trucks at the edge of the search site, sipping coffee from a paper cup that had long gone lukewarm when one of the rangers raised his head sharply. His radio crackled with a tone I hadn't heard before, short-clipped, urgent. He didn't say anything to me, just lifted his pack onto his shoulder and started moving uphill at a pace that made the gravel spit under his boots. Another deputy followed, then another. The quiet chatter around the staging area faded into a tense silence. Something had changed, and even before anyone spoke, I felt it press through my chest like a cold hand. I climbed into the back of a truck with Deputy Lewis, and we drove a short distance up a narrow service road that cut through a stand of spruce. The wheels jolted over ruts, and each bump sent a dull thud through my ribs. Lewis didn't look at me, didn't say a word, just tightened his grip on the wheel. When we reached the spot where the road ended, a cluster of deputies were gathered around a man holding a small drone controller. The drone hovered in the air above the treetops, a faint mechanical buzz filtering down through the branches. The operator adjusted the controls, and the screen in his hands lit his face in a pale glow. "Got smoke," he said. His voice carried a strange mix of confidence and unease. "Thin, maybe, from a small fire. Could be old, but it's there." I stood behind him and looked at the monitor. The camera panned over a slope, tangled with fallen logs and boulders. In the middle of that chaos, half hidden beneath branches, was a faint ribbon of gray rising into the morning air. My body reacted before my mind caught up. My knees went weak, and I had to steady myself against the side of the truck. The cold air felt suddenly too thin. Deputies began moving fast, their voices low and focused. Someone radioed for additional units. Someone else marked coordinates on a map with a thick red marker. The wind stirred the needles overhead, and the soft hiss of it mixed with the metallic click of rifles being checked and radios being secured. I watched them prepare, feeling the world narrow into a single point, whatever waited at the end of that trail. They didn't let me follow. They told me to stay with Lewis in the clearing until they knew what they were dealing with. So I stood there, hands shoved into the pockets of my jacket, listening to the crunch of boots fade into the woods. The forest seemed to close around them, swallowing their movement, leaving behind only the distant call of a jay and the soft hum of the drone circling above. Minutes dragged into something closer to hours. I paced between the trees, each step brushing against cold grass and brittle twigs. Every sound felt amplified, the groan of shifting branches, the distant rumble of a truck repositioning itself, even my own breathing, shallow and uneven. I kept looking down the trail, waiting for someone to reappear. Then the radio on Lewis's chest crackled sharply. A voice came through, breathless, tense. Structure located. Possible shelter. Unknown occupancy. Shelter. That word settled heavily into the pit of my stomach. Not campsite, not debris. Shelter. Lewis and I drove as close as the road allowed, then hiked the last stretch. The air grew cooler as we moved deeper into the shade of the gorge. I could smell damp earth, wet bark, and something faintly acrid burned wood, maybe. The deputies had marked the route with fluorescent flags, bright colors fluttering against the muted tones of the forest. When we reached the final rise, the ground sloped down into a narrow clearing carved between rock walls. There it was. A hut, if you could call it that, stood crookedly in the center, pieced together from scavenged boards, tarps, and sheets of rusted metal. Smoke drifted from a hole in the roof, thin and hesitant, as if uncertain whether it should rise at all. The structure looked fragile, like a breath of wind might collapse it. Yet there was something unsettling about the way it stood, as if it belonged there. Deputies formed a half circle around the doorway, weapons lowered but ready. The silence was so complete I could hear the soft crackle of embers inside. Lewis held out his arm when I tried to step forward. His voice was quiet, steady, but firm. "Let them clear it first." I nodded, though my eyes were locked on the doorway. A deputy knocked gently on the makeshift door. The sound echoed strangely hollow and uneven. For a moment, nothing moved. Then something shifted inside, a faint rustling, like cloth dragging across the ground. The door creaked inward. A figure stepped into the light. My breath caught. My vision blurred around the edges, the cold seeping into my bones. The woman standing there was almost unrecognizable hair, long and tangled, streaked with gray skin drawn tight over high cheekbones, bare feet dusted with dirt. Her clothes looked handmade, stitched together from scraps of fabric and thin leather. Her arms hung motionless at her sides, but it was her face that will never leave me. Her lips were pulled into a smile that felt wrong, fixed as if carved. And her eyes, they didn't meet ours. They didn't even seem to register us. She looked through us, past us, into some distance only she could see. A deputy asked her name. She didn't respond. Someone tried again, voice softer. Her gaze didn't shift. Then in a voice so faint it barely rose above the wind, she whispered a phrase. Repeated it. And again. The words floated over the clearing like a chill. Something about someone building something, about the foundations. I felt the ground tilt beneath me. It was Megan. When they confirmed it first through fingerprints, then through a careful comparison of features I barely recognized, I felt everything inside me loosen. Relief isn't the right word. It was too sharp, too jagged. It was closer to shock, wrapped in a grief I didn't yet understand. I tried to approach her, but my legs refused to move. My body had become something separate from me, frozen in place. The medical team moved in quickly. They spoke in low, steady tones, guiding her to sit on a blanket. She obeyed without hesitation, lowering herself as if pushed by invisible hands. Her eyes never left that same distant point. While they examined her, deputies entered the hut. I stayed outside, leaning against a tree to steady myself. The inside smelled of charred wood, old sweat, and cold stone. They carried out small objects wrapped in cloth crude tools made from stone bundles of dried berries. A wooden box filled with polished rocks arranged by color. On the inner walls, drawn in charcoal, were circles, triangles, and human figures sketched in unsettling patterns. A crude wooden cross hung from a corner tied with rope. The investigators whispered to each other, their faces, pale movements measured. The forest felt heavier around us, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. As the pieces of the scene came together, so did the truth. Slowly at first, then with a clarity that chilled me deeper than the cold air ever could. Someone had taken her. Someone had kept her. Someone had built that shelter, those symbols, that world around her. and someone else had been with her. Fingerprints found on the tools, the walls, the small items buried near the hut prints that didn't match. Megan belonged to a man once employed at a gear shop in Silverton. A man who'd vanished the same summer she did. A man named Elijah Rowan, though I didn't hear that name until later. At that moment, all I knew was that someone had shaped an entire existence around her in that hidden place, and that he was still out there. They lifted Megan onto a stretcher as gently as if she were made of glass. Her hands trembled once when a gust of cold wind swept through the clearing. I stepped closer, then close enough to see the faint scars tracing her arms, the way her fingers curled and uncurled, as if remembering something painful. When she turned her head slightly, just for a moment, her eyes met mine. They didn't hold, didn't linger, but they passed over me like someone searching through fog. And then she looked away again. I don't remember walking back to the trucks. I don't remember the hike out or the sound of branches snapping underfoot. What I remember is the hollow in my chest, the way every breath felt thin and unsteady. The world around me seemed muted, as if distance had settled between me and everything else. By the time we reached town, the news had moved ahead of us. Deputies scrambled to secure the area, calling in federal agencies and specialized teams. The air outside the sheriff's building smelled of diesel from idling vehicles and the faint sweetness of someone's cigarette drifting from the alley. Reporters had begun to gather by dusk, their voices low, cameras lifted like watchful eyes. Inside, the station buzzed with a quiet urgency, phones ringing keys, clacking maps, being marked and remarked. Someone handed me a bottle of water I didn't open. Another offered a chair I didn't take. My own voice felt distant, like it belonged to someone speaking through me. They told me she'd been taken to a hospital in Durango. They told me she was alive. They told me she was fragile but stable. What they didn't tell me, what none of us said aloud, was that whatever had happened to her in that hut in those mountains, in those 4 lost years, was only beginning to show itself. As night settled over the station, the fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a pale glow across the worn linoleum. A deputy walked past, holding a thick folder with fresh evidence tags, his expression grim. In the conference room, the sheriff closed the blinds and locked the door behind him. And in that quiet moment, standing by the window with the cold glass pressed against my palm, I understood with a calmness that frightened me. Whatever waited in the next room, in the next report, in the next hour, was going to change everything again. The long night ahead had already begun. In the hours after they found Megan, the town moved with a kind of hushed urgency, as if everyone sensed the line that had been crossed, but no one quite knew how to say it aloud. Deputies came and went through the station doors, tracking in pine needles and damp earth from the clearing where the hut stood. Phones rang in short-clipped bursts, and every ring made my stomach tighten. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed quietly, a soft electric buzz that blended with the low murmur of voices around me. I remember sitting in a stiff plastic chair near the back wall, my hands wrapped around a cup of water I never drank, trying to understand how someone could be both here and missing at the same time. Somewhere down the hall, someone clicked through medical forms and another person whispered into a radio about transport routes. The world felt too bright, too sharp for what we were facing. When they drove her to the hospital in Durango, I followed in the back seat of a patrol car. The heater pushed warm air at my knees, but my hands stayed cold, pressed against the window as the mountains slid by in dark silhouettes. The deputy driving didn't speak, not out of indifference, but because there was nothing useful to say. The road wound through narrow passes where patches of old snow clung stubbornly to the shadows, and each turn made my chest tighten. I kept picturing her in that stretcher carried out of the clearing like something the forest had been hiding. Every time the patrol car slowed for a curve, I felt my breath catch as if I were bracing for something I couldn't name. At the hospital, they moved her straight into a quiet wing, the kind where the lights are softer, and the walls carry the faint smell of antiseptic and warm linens. A nurse guided me to a waiting room with cushioned chairs and a window looking out at a parking lot lit by tall lamps. The glass reflected my own tired face more than anything outside. I sat there listening to the soft hiss of a ventilation vent, thinking about the 4 years she'd been gone and the way her voice had sounded in her last message. I held on to that sound like a lifeline. Our parents flew in the next morning. My mother walked into the waiting room with her coat half buttoned, her hair still smelling faintly of airport air, and when she hugged me, she trembled. My father stood behind her shoulders, stiff, one hand clutching the handle of his suitcase. They hadn't seen the footage from the clearing yet. They didn't know about the drawings on the walls or the strange symbols carved into pieces of scrap wood. All they knew was that their daughter was alive and that everything else would have to be faced in its time. When I told them what little I could, my mother covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes shining in a way I'll never forget. Law enforcement acted quickly once they identified the fingerprints in the hut. They already had a name by the time the sun set that first night, Elijah Rowan. I learned that name in a dim office where a detective slid a folder across the table toward me, the paper inside smelling of toner and old dust. Rowan had worked in Silverton briefly, helping tourists choose gear and map out trails. He'd vanished just after Megan did. The deputies spoke about him in low, controlled tones, as if the mere sound of his name had to be handled carefully. Over the next weeks, the investigation widened beyond anything I could have imagined. Deputies searched abandoned mines, ravines tangled with deadfall, and narrow mountain spurs, where old paths had long since vanished. Federal agents joined them, bringing equipment that hummed and clicked in the cold morning air. Each new discovery added to the shape of the story tools that had been carved and recarved, drawings that repeated the same geometric symbols, traces of other people who had passed through that hidden space. There were nights when I sat by Megan's bedside, listening to the steady beep of the heart monitor, while investigators down the hall compared notes and sifted through fragments of her lost years. When they finally found Rowan's main encampment high in the mountains, winter had already started to settle onto the ridges. I wasn't there, but I heard the details later from Detective Mercer, who spoke about it with a heaviness that settled into every sentence. He told me about the wooden structures arranged in a semicircle, the crude tower rising in the middle like a monument to a belief no one else could understand. He said Rowan was sitting near the entrance when they approached, calm and still, as if he'd been expecting them. They found 2 other people there, thin and confused, their eyes unfocused in a way that reminded me too much of the look on Megan's face the day they carried her out of the hut. The arrest made headlines, though the sheriff's office kept tight control over the release of information. Reporters gathered outside the courthouse weeks later, their breath fogging in the cold air as they tried to capture every movement. Rowan was quiet through most of the hearings, showing no fear, no anger, just a distant calm that unsettled everyone in the room. When the trial began, the judge ordered no cameras, and the walls of the courtroom seemed to hold the weight of every testimony. I took the stand, once my hands cold against the wooden railing, the overhead lights casting a pale wash across the benches. The prosecutor asked careful questions, and I answered them as best I could, my voice steady even when my throat tightened. Rowan was sentenced to life without parole. When the verdict was read, he sat still, hands folded on the table as though he were listening to a weather report instead of the shape of the rest of his life. The room was quiet, except for the rustle of paper and the faint creak of wooden pews as people shifted. I remember the judge's gavel sounding like a stone dropped into deep water, distant final. In the months that followed, Silverton tried to find its footing again. Some of the search volunteers still nodded to me in town when I visited their faces, carrying a tenderness that felt both comforting and difficult. The cafe where Megan had eaten before her hike hung a small lantern in the window for those still missing in the mountains. The trailhead where her car had been found grew quiet again, the wind carving the same patterns through the trees as if the land were trying to heal. But there's a kind of memory that holds on in places like that, settling into the grain of old wood and the cracks in the rocks. You can feel it if you stand still long enough. As for Megan, recovery has been slow and uneven. For a long time she barely spoke, her body reacting to sudden noises with a flinch she couldn't control. She spent hours tracing invisible shapes on the sheets of her hospital bed, as if trying to map her way out of a place only she remembered. Eventually, she moved to a long-term care facility closer to Denver, where the rooms are quiet and the windows look out on a courtyard filled with tall grasses. There are days when her eyes clear for a moment, and she recognizes something. A song on the radio, the smell of hand lotion, the sound of my voice reading aloud. But the past has left deep marks, and she carries them in ways no one else can fully understand. I visit her every week, sitting beside her bed while she sketches with gentle strokes on thick paper. Her drawings are simpler now, mountain outlines, trees, the curve of a trail winding upward. Sometimes she pauses, tilts her head as if listening to a memory passing through her. On good days, she'll take my hand and hold it lightly, her fingers warm against mine. On harder days, she sits perfectly still, eyes fixed on a point beyond the window as if the world outside is both too close and too far. I've learned to live with the weight of it, the slow ache of knowing what she endured, the strange relief of knowing she survived, and the grief for the years she lost. The mountains no longer look the same to me. When I drive past them, I see more than ridgelines and forests. I see the places where she walked, the places where she was hidden, the shadows that held her without letting go. And I see the people who brought her back step by step through weather and fear and silence. Years later, one image still stays with me. It's from a visit not long after she began speaking again. She sat by the window, sunlight warm against her cheek, her hands resting in her lap. She turned to me with a softness I hadn't seen in a long time and said very quietly, "It's quieter now." And for a moment I felt something loosen in my chest. If you're still here with me, let me know where you're listening from and follow the channel so these stories are never forgotten.